We're in the capital of the Renaissance, and one of the themes I've been pushing a lot on the conference circuit is to handle the sort of problems of the current day, we need a Renaissance, not an Enlightenment. It's kind of like, not because I'm a Catholic and the Enlightenment was Protestant, though there are elements of that within the way this works. But the Renaissance was the discovery of old things as well as a reinvention of the new. It wasn't an attempt to throw everything out and replace it. And if you go back to Vico, who's one of my favorite Italian philosophers, he basically says of the Enlightenment, look guys, you've got some really great ideas here, but why are you abandoning everything which we knew from the past? I've just come back from Australia where we've been combining our research techniques with indigenous people in Australia, and there are things they know about the land which we've lost completely. So this concept of Renaissance is a concept of the old and the new, reimagining, rediscovering, and I want to hold that theme. I'd also, on the basis that my Irish colleague goes around on a motorbike, this is my bike. In Welsh, we take real bikes, yeah? We're not going to do the real bike art. Yeah, that's all right. This was made for me. With my great regret, it's Shimano, not Campag. And my last one was Campag, but Campag didn't have the automatic gears ready for this in time. But I just thought I'd make that point, all right, just to come on that. The field I work in is called naturalizing sense-making, and I'm using the metaphor there of a craftsman, a potter. And it's quite important, I think, we understand that in the Lean and Agile community. A true craftsman, first of all, they take a huge amount of time to acquire the craft. There's an apprentice, there's a journeyman stage. Some people become masters, but not everybody, right? And they understand what Aristotle called phronesis, but also what Aristotle called Sophia. So practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom, and you need both. If you don't have practical experience and practical wisdom acquired over time, then you're ineffective. But if you don't have the theory, nothing you do will scale. And I'll come back to Agile later, but one of the massive problems with Agile is they don't have any theory. They just carry on doing what they think worked for them last time. And then they misuse the word empirical, which they obviously don't understand, and say, do more of this. So theory-informed practice, or what we used to say in the 70s, practice makes perfect, which was always a good joke at the time. Now, sense-making, there are 5 established schools of sense-making. You can have the papers on that if you want. I'm one of those. I use a hyphen. Sorry, whether you use a hyphen or not is really significant. These things matter, right? If it's a hyphen, it's a verb. If it hasn't got a hyphen, it's a noun. And for me, sense-making is how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. You never know everything you need to know, but you need to know what sort of things you can do on the basis of what you do know. And that's going to be a key theme on this. Naturalizing, my first degree is physics and philosophy as a joint honours. My father was a rural veterinary surgeon, and if you've been forced to do sheath washings on a bull on a cold February day, being laughed at by Welsh farmers, you decide that theoretical physics and philosophy is the pathway to take, right? But it means I have a physicist's despair of social scientists. They never have enough data to form any valid conclusion in the first place. You'll see that come through later. And I have a philosopher's delight about concepts and language, so you'll see that come through as well, right? But naturalizing in philosophy means to base what you do in the natural sciences. Right? And if anybody wants the background on this, most of us now in this field are coming from what's called neo-materialism, which is a sort of rejection of social constructivism, critical realism, modernism, and postmodernism. And if anybody wants more about that, grab me over lunch and I'll talk about it. Interestingly, massive contribution to that from the feminist literature, because people in philosophy and feminism have started to realize if everything is relative, then Trump is valid. And so materialism has attractions, right? So this is a realist, materialist, scientific approach. Now, we're not saying that you can apply science, traditional science, to the whole of human systems. It's too much complication, too much interaction, too much complexity. But you can say there's things we know about human cognition and systems which act as what are called enabling constraints. And I'm going to run through 3 of those at the moment. So there's no point in developing tools or methods which contradict what we know from natural science just because we would like it to be different. So that's kind of the approach. Yeah? And the other thing I want to make, and I think this is a big problem for lean and for agile, I'll come back to this towards the end of this talk, in that they seem to entirely focus on production, not on requirements. Yeah, so it's kind of like, our job is to be the most efficient producer or whatever you can. The manufacturing metaphors dominate. The engineering metaphors have dominated in management science since the 80s. And everybody forgets that actually the real issue is what you decide to do. So I'm going to sort of focus on that and argue that a co-evolutionary approach to that is absolutely critical. It's even worse in Agile because Agile people do not like users. Users are a great inconvenience, so they force them to nominate one of their number to define what they want and have occasional interactions with the team. And they're meant to be really grateful when we give them software because it's what they really wanted. So I really want to try and break that concept as well as we go through this. And I think one of the key things on that is the need to develop outliers. I'll just throw out some stuff. I'm going to develop more of this in tomorrow's session. We've done a lot of work on health and safety over the last 4 or 5 years, both in manufacturing and in blue light services. And we've actually found the major cause of accidents and the major cause of mental breakdown is not the job, it's the health and safety rules. And the reason is the health and safety rules are devised on a retrospective study of what people say happened. You've immediately got a problem there because people don't remember things the same way that they actually happened within 10 or 15 minutes. And then they take a normal distribution and they develop rules based on a normal distribution. Now the trouble is people's lives are in the tails of a Pareto distribution. Yeah, the reality of any job is there are so many things which couldn't be predicted that you force people into a position where they have to choose between job completion and rule compliance. And this is a massive problem in the health sector at the moment because we're forcing medical staff into choosing between following the rules and providing empathetic care to patients, and it's a completely meaningless choice. And part of the problem is over-constraining or making over-rigid the system. I'll talk in a minute or two about one of the key complexity concepts, which is distributed decision-making, which is very different from delegated decision-making. And distributed decision-making is one of the ways we overcome those sort of problems. So you'll start to see these come through. So let's go through some basic science. And sorry for people who've seen this before, but it's a basic one. First one is this. For some reason we don't understand, radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community. They obviously did something really evil at some point in their past, so all the experiments are run on them. So if you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, then 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk to the 83% who didn't. This is called inattentional blindness, and it's a part of what we are as a species. If you think about the early hominids, the way you make decisions is you scan about 3 to 5% of the available data. That's the most you'll take account of. That triggers a series of memories, and they're not just cognitive. We're into post-Cartesian models of consciousness now. Consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, and its social interactions. It's not identical with the brain. So basically that triggers cognitive memories, physical memories, social memories through stories and accounts of things we've heard from other people. We blend those together. It's called conceptual blending. This is happening in nanoseconds. And the first blended pattern which fits, we apply. So based on a very partial data scan, we do a first fit pattern match and we act accordingly. Now, if you think about evolution, you can see why we do that. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and have an identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of a manual of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly, privileging our most recent collective or individual experiences. And that's how you all make decisions. And that isn't going to change. So build in decision support systems and strategy processes based on the assumption that if everybody has the right information and the right training, they will make the right decisions, is fundamentally flawed. So we have to rethink that one a little bit because it's going to be different. Oh, and by the way, we have to find the 17% before they talk to the 83%. Yeah, and actually the golden news on this is there are huge opportunities out there waiting to be discovered, but we don't see them because we do not see what we do not expect to see. And if you come to myself, Gary Klein, who's one of the other 5 schools of sense-making, Brenda Dervin, what all of us say is there's no such thing as a cognitive bias. They are all cognitive heuristics. In evolutionary terms, they all have advantages at a species level, which is why they've evolved. So trying to overcome them, again, is a fundamental mistake. Being aware of them, that's different, but you can't overcome them. And I'll talk about some methods for that in a minute. The second thing is I assume that all of you who have children tell them stories. Everybody, bedtime stories, things like that. Do you tell them stories about how Janet and John stayed at home, conformed with the family mission statement, achieved the family KPIs? I mean, you don't tell stories like that, do you? Yeah, basically all fairy stories in all storytelling traditions, basically have doom, disaster, despondency, despair, and failure built into them. We have a happy ending because we kind of want them to sleep at night, but we hold that off as long as possible because we want to scare, to use an Irish phrase, the living Jesus out of them, because actually sharing failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than sharing success. The human brain actually picks up on failure faster than success. What stories spread around companies? Stories of failure, stories of success. We evolved as malicious gossips because it has evolutionary advantage. We actually now build worse practice systems for companies. Worse practice systems have more learning in them than best practice systems. You can use fiction to create them. Fiction evolved so we could share ideas of failure which were purely fictional or which were true, but we don't want to say we did it. Yeah, one of the things, there's lots of things we do with fiction in that way. One of the things we now do on mission statements, anybody got a corporate mission statement? Remember them? Okay, mission statements started with Ackoff. Then the consultants stopped making money out of them, so they decided we'd have common values. Everybody remember that period? Then that sort of got a bit boring, so they created Purpose. Somebody made a lot of money out of the book on purpose. And just to scare you, the next book coming out is called Deep Purpose. So the cycle is about to start again. And each time we go around this cycle, the same consultants sit with the same executives and write the same platitudes on the same flip charts. And their poor employees, it's like Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets, and you're all meant to follow it. We take a different approach. We actually agree the defining stories of what we don't want to be. Because that actually is much easier to get a consensus, and it leaves open possibilities that we couldn't have anticipated, which we can explore. And if you look at the Bible, it tells enigmatic, it asks questions through stories, or it makes you aware of what you shouldn't do. It never really tells you what you should do. Yeah, and that's true of all storytelling traditions. So, and also, by the way, narrative is still the fundamental sense-making method of everybody. I've done loads of work with engineers over the world. The real learning is done through micro-stories over a beer in a shift change. So if we can capture and use those stories, that's very effective. And I can do more about that in tomorrow's masterclass. And the final one is complexity. This has now become fashionable. The world and his wife now have complexity methods. It's just getting really terrible because they're reading the Wikipedia entry on it, and that's the limit of their study before they create a certification in it. So we're trying to get some authenticity into this. The best metaphor I've ever seen for complexity is from Alicia Gerraro. She says it's like bramble bushes in a thicket. Everything, bramble bushes are those sort of very thorny things which produce wonderful fruits. And a thicket is a small woodland. Yeah, now aside from long distance cycling, I do 200 kilometers on that cycle. Yeah, I also love long distance walking. Yeah, and I go walking with two doctors, which you would think was a good idea, except that one of them insists on, he doesn't like tracks. If you've ever been led into actually a small woodland stocked with bramble bushes, because he wants to discover a 19th century Welsh farm, ruined farm, you kind of realize the danger of entanglement. Yeah, everything is connected with everything else. You can't actually take it apart and put it back together again. If you go to the Greek and Latin roots of the words complexity and complicated, complicated is to fold, and if you fold something, you can unfold it. Complex is to entangle, and you can't untangle something once it's entangled. Right? So complexity is a very different way of thinking. And by the way, it's a phase shift between whether a system is ordered or whether it's complex in terms of the way things work. So what I want to do is to give you in this first part of this a sort of brief view of what complexity is about. The key thing to understand is that there is no linear material causality. What actually happened at the time of Kant and the Enlightenment is everybody forgot Aristotle talked about 4 causes. They focused on just one of them. And the trouble is, we now all think that's the case. It's called fundamental attribution error. If something happens, we assume it has a cause. Now, the reality is it doesn't. If you've ever read, anybody read the congressional report on 9/11? Okay, it's worth reading. It's actually quite valuable. I spent a huge amount of my life working on counterterrorism before and after 9/11 and working with that report. But if you look at any government report on something which has gone wrong, they always look backwards, and with the benefit of the hindsight, they come up with this lovely phrase, why didn't we join up the dots? Everybody familiar with that phrase? Kind of like, now we're looking backwards, we can see why these things happen. So somebody been trained to take off and fly but not land, we now realize the significance of it, so we celebrate that person, we promote them, and we write new laws and new procedures so that that won't happen again. Everybody familiar with this? Okay. Well, your first question for the day is a quick one on dots. Yeah? So if I actually have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots, then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 linkages between the dots. So 4 dots is 6 linkages. I'll give you the figure. It's 64 possible patterns that can emerge from the dots and the links between the dots. If I go up to 10 dots, what's that figure? Guesses, please. I don't want the formula, I want a number. So 4 dots is 64, 10 dots. What's the number? Shout out the number. You haven't got time to calculate it, you've got to guess. 2 million. How many people think 2 million is too high? Too low? Not putting your hand up because you know you're going to get it wrong, and yeah, okay. It's actually too low. Any more guesses? Okay, I'll put you out of your misery. It's actually just over 3.4 trillion. If I go up to 12, it's just over 4.8 quadrillion. There's an old story in China called the Emperor's Chessboard, where a sage asks for a reward, says, I'll have 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, double thereafter. There is enough rice in China. How many dots are there in the human system? How many possible patterns are there? Yeah? The idea, and this is actually, we can get into free will if you want later on this, the minute you get into a human organism, there are so many possible connections and permutations, you can't predict anything from the particles at a low level. Everything, and you can't actually apply retrospective coherence. So what we have to do, and this is a key phrase, we have to manage in the present moment, not in a desired future state. Yeah, and this is a key phrase within complexity in terms of the way we work. So going into this in more detail, first of all, just to be clear on this, complexity thinking is not a subset of systems thinking. They have different antecedents. There are some overlaps between the two, but you can see the difference between complexity science and systems thinking. That sort of says everything. They are actually not the same thing. One comes from a scientific background, the other comes from information theory from Shannon. And there's intersections from time to time, but they're actually different. Yeah? So please don't do that confusion because it irritates people like me. There are three reasons for that. One is complexity deals with systems which don't have boundaries. Yeah, the reality, and this is a problem because systems thinking has traditionally said system has boundaries and boundary management is important. And the answer is yes, some systems do, but not all systems. Yeah, some systems are dissipative. They don't have boundaries. They have sort of zones, but that's entirely different. The second thing is this concept of starting journeys with a sense of direction. If you want a simple way of realizing this, this is called the Frozen 2 strategy. Has everybody seen Frozen 2 yet? Okay, it's a great complexity movie. You've now got a good excuse to go and watch it, even if you haven't got children and grandchildren. Professor Snowden said it's a complexity movie, right? In the middle of that movie, there's this wonderful moment where the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the younger sister without the magic, sings, "All I can do is do the next right thing." Yeah? Now, in complexity, that's known as the adjacent possible. Remember the mist from the first speaker's slides? Faced with that, you can do the next right things and look again. So we start journeys with a sense of direction. We deliberately avoid clear objectives. Because the trouble is, in a complex system, if you define the output of a complex system, it's not possible because you can't predict it, and you produce perverse incentives in the system to comply with the measurement system rather than achieve the result. It's called Goodhart's law. If I take Stratton's variation of that, the minute a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure because it results in gaming behavior. In complexity, it's worse because it gives you a false perspective. You're focused on something which is probably wrong, so you miss opportunities for things which actually could be more valuable. So we start journeys with a sense of direction. We don't have goals. And I've yet to be to a systems thinking seminar where they didn't start having a workshop where everybody agreed what the future state would be. Now, you just don't do that in complexity. It's a fundamental mistake. And the third one, and this is important, a complex system is dispositional. And aspects of the system have what Popper called propensities. So a propensity means these sort of things are likely to happen. Yeah, so that's useful to know, and this is a dispositional map. Yeah, this actually shows, this is based on a mass participation over the whole workforce, and this is actually a dispositional map of culture as it happens, where we've gathered in the stories that people are told when they join the company. They've been interpreted at the point of origin by the storytellers, not by a computer, and from that we've drawn, this is a probability map, a fitness landscape, which fundamentally shows, if you look at it, that the system has dispositional states here, an outlier group here. Remember the 17%? And another dispositional state there. Now, I said, this is what we now do with complexity and strategy, is we first of all start by mapping the dispositional state of the system. We identify where we are, or more likely, where different parts of the organization are because they're in different spaces. And then we define the trajectory or the vector that we should take. And we find the next step to move to, and then we look again. Right? That's the Frozen 2 type approach. And that's dispositionality and propensities. So I'll go through more of this in detail tomorrow. So there are some implications. First of all, delegated decision-making doesn't work because everybody worries about whether they're doing what the main authority worked. We take a different approach, and I'll give you the first time I ever used this before I knew about complexity. I was a general manager of a business. Sorry, I've been there operationally, I've been there strategically. And I got called in to meet the CEO, and he said, I want you to write the ISO 9001 manual. Anybody written an ISO 9001 manual? Okay, it's the quality control standard. And I said, why are you asking me? Normally, you beat me up for breaking the rules. Now you want me to write them. And he said, poachers make the best gamekeepers. or thieves make the best police, which is probably true. He said, if you write it, there's some chance we'll pass. If I give it to quality control, it will end up as a 15-volume manual with a 2-week training course, and I'll have to double the size of quality to get through the examination. So I ended up writing a 75-page manual, which was a series of do case statements. So I said, if this happens, we do this. If this happens, we do this. If this happens, you can do this, this, or this, provided you've got this educational background. Now, that's actually clear and complicated in Cynefin. And then it stopped, and it said, if anything else happens, you bring in 2 more people from these divisions in these roles with this amount of experience, and you make a decision collectively which you document. Now, you don't have to refer up or refer down. You just have to do that and show transparency. Yeah? And that got us through. We also, by the way, realized that some general managers couldn't be trusted to answer questions from quality control inspectors in the right way. It wasn't that they ever lied, it's just they didn't know how to tell the truth in a way that it could be understood. So we had a list of them, and if ever a quality control inspector arrived on the site, and it was random visits, security were under strict instructions to challenge their ID, make an emergency phone call, and we evacuated all of those general managers from the site. We actually practiced on this. We could do it in 7 minutes, so that their nominated deputies could answer the question. Now, I dropped a hint on that. What we were doing was gaming the system. Anything explicit will be gamed. And that's really important to understand. Yeah? And the trouble is, it's going to encourage the people who are gamers rather than people who really want to do the work. Right? So you have to be very careful on that. We can talk about vector targets tomorrow. So distributed decision making is really important. We're now doing it, for example, in user design. So what we do is, instead of having a systems analyst interview people, remember not seeing gorillas? The analyst will only hear what they expect to hear. Just to really scare you, if you conduct more than 2 interviews, you form a subconscious hypothesis, and you only pay attention to things that match that hypothesis thereafter, which rather undermines most consultancy exercises. Yeah, you just can't work. It doesn't work like that. We want to reduce the energy cost of decision making, so we get into conclusions very fast. So what we do is, instead of that, we put people together in 3s. Young, bright programmer with systems architect. Somebody sees the big picture. Together with user trained to talk to IT people. Now, we're about to go public with this, by the way. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. And we throw 15 trios at a problem for 3 weeks part-time and see what they come up with. You see what I'm doing? I'm putting cognitively, culturally diverse teams together, working them in parallel before I form conclusions, and that's working within the scientific approach. We're doing the same in communities at the moment. We've got young people with their grandparents. Now, there's cognitive science reasons for that linked to brain plasticity. Grandparents tell things to grandchildren they don't tell to their children, and vice versa. So we put young teenagers together with people from their grandparents' generation and put them in a trio with somebody from local government who can make their ideas work. And that generates urban regeneration at scale, with lots and lots of small sustainable projects, but with complete transparency rather than major initiatives. And in a complex world, you need people to make decisions at the point of engagement with reality without reference back. So this concept is called entangled trios as a method of putting together combinations of roles with qualifications, allows you to distribute decision making without loss of authority, in terms of the way it works. And that's a key complexity principle in terms of the way we work. Next one, you need to have parallel testing. Now, the word coherence is important here. If anybody is offended by this, I do not apologize. You need... we know that evolutionary theory, although it's coherent to the facts, we know most of it's wrong. If you look at the neo-Darwinian period, we thought culture couldn't inherit. We now know through epigenetics the biological mechanism by which culture does inherit, which is actually quite scary when you think about it, right? Famous one on this is if you give Mice, the mice have this one, I've forgotten what the smell is, but there's one food that they love. So if you give mice that food and let them eat it, then you start to shock them. Yeah, they end up freezing every time they have the smell. Then you leave them alone, but they don't encounter the food. You don't let their children encounter the food, but you let their grandchildren encounter the food, and they freeze even though they're not shocked. So we now know that that sort of behavioral memory culture, we know the mechanism in inheritance is linked to the allele structure of RNA. So actually we now know that that was wrong, but we've moved on. But the point is, at any one stage in the history of science, science is coherent to the facts as we understand them. We're open to change. Young Earth creationism is incoherent to the facts. It's not worth pursuing. And this is a really important thing for companies. We have a whole body of methods for this, by the way, is you have to test whose ideas are coherent, not whose ideas are right. And anybody will tell you this. I've been a C-level executive. You get 10 minutes to make a decision. And 5 groups of people come into your office with well-researched proposals, with brilliant slide sets. How the hell do you decide? Well, once you understand complexity, you don't. You say, I want a safe-to-fail experiment to see whether your idea is a good one or not. And then you run those in parallel and see what happens. And by the way, the experiments never really succeed or fail. They change the space so a solution becomes more obvious. And again, that's more energy efficient. Yeah? You test for coherence, you run things in parallel, you see what's actually possible in terms of the way it works. And then the other big thing on complexity is a complex system scales by decomposition to the lowest level of coherence and then recombination. It's rather like DNA. From the whole of DNA, the whole of organic life form comes. Complex systems don't scale by repeating what you did in one context in another one, or by aggregating practices into a massive construct. Complex systems scale by decomposition and recombination, and that has huge implications for information management and decision support. And again, I'll go through some more details in that in tomorrow's class. So, final point on this is complexity is not a metaphor. Yeah, you find a lot of people say complexity is a metaphor. It isn't. Complexity is real. Complex systems exist. It's not just about human perception. Yeah, the way we know things, the way we perceive things and where they are have to have friction between them so we get closer in touch with reality. So, kind of like I thought I'd get into the Italian on this for you. And I'm not going to risk pronouncing this. But the origins of the word management actually from an Italian word, which means the ability to ride a horse. It then gets corrupted by the French. Many things have been corrupted by the French. Not as many as have been corrupted by the English, but lots, right? To mean household management. Now, both are right or wrong. Manage or menage. Right? And I give an example there. That's the White Horse of Uffington. That's a Neolithic sculpture on a hillside just north of where I live. That captures the essence of what a horse is quite brilliantly in a few lines. It's an abstraction. Down there is my mother's book that she was given by my grandfather, who didn't think she was a suitable wife for his son. It's called Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management. If you ever get a copy of this, it's brilliant. It tells you how to manage your servants, what to pay them, how to treat illness, and it's got recipes. Everything that you ever need to know is laid down as a set of rules. Now, the point is we need to balance one with the other. Yeah? And it's not that they coexist. I actually disagree with a speaker earlier on that. It's not that they coexist, but they work in different contexts. And that's really important to understand. In this context, I use these rules. In this context, I use heuristics. Now, if you want more on this, this is the EU field guide. I was working with the European Union before the stupidity of the English took us out. Sorry, that is the English fault, all right? So basically, before I was working with them, they'd adopted Cynefin as a framework for governance. I'm back there next year working on that in more detail. But we repurposed the project very quickly to write this when COVID hit. So this is the European Union field guide to how to manage complexity in a crisis. I'm the principal author. Alessandra, who's on the design team, did all the work on it and a lot of the wordsmithing, yeah, and some of the content. So this actually is really useful for people because it lays out complexity. And it talks about 3 things that you need to do to be a resilient organization. Now, I want to make a key difference between robustness and resilience here. So robustness is like a seawall or a riverbank. It's wonderfully robust. It's very efficient because I can actually farm on the landward side. And it's really useful until it breaks, and then the result is catastrophic. Right? On the other hand, we had a seawall break in the Gower Peninsula in South Wales recently. Well, recently in geographical time, not human time. And so they decided not to rebuild it. They let the land become a salt marsh. Salt marsh is a hugely rich ecological environment. And if you haven't eaten Welsh salt marsh lamb, go and buy some now. It's absolutely brilliant because of the herbs and everything else. But the point about the salt marsh is it absorbs a huge amount of water. And even when it's saturated, it doesn't release it. And it survives by constantly shifting and changing. So a robust system doesn't change. A breach is catastrophic. A resilient system changes. Release is not catastrophic, but it's inefficient compared with a robust system. And this is the efficiency v. effectiveness argument, right? And by the way, to be effective, you have to be inefficient. Boassa and I, when he was alive, worked on a measure of what we call requisite inefficiency. So how can we measure how inefficient you need to be based on your market context? And that's still relevant, yeah, in today's environment. So first thing you need to do is use your employees as a sensor network. Remember that picture I showed earlier? I've got every employee able to give me feedback within 3 minutes. So faced with a situation where I've got high ambiguity, I don't commission research, I use my networks to give me patterns, and a dominant pattern is evidence-based to proceed. This is what we're also now looking at citizens. I argued 8 years ago, if we had every school child at the age of 16 as an ethnographer into their communities, we'd have a human sensor network which, quote unquote, if we ever have a major pandemic, will be really useful because we can actually do lockdown progressively where people are ready to do it. We won't have to do universal. And as another speaker said, if you think COVID was bad, you've got no idea what's coming. There are bacteria thawing out in Siberia at the moment to which we have absolutely zero resistance. And bacterial plagues are far more deadly than viral plagues in human history. And we're going to be facing that within my lifetime, and I'm 68. Right? So we need to start to build these things at company level and society level now, because we can't do the gross solutions we did during COVID. We're going to have to do something more sophisticated. Second thing is you need to build informal networks. Remember that method I taught for software development? We put young employees together with people about to retire, together with somebody on the management development program. Yet what we're constantly doing is entangling people in different combinations, because if you entangle people, that's the way you share knowledge across silos. And you can measure this. So informal networks are actually the mycelium, the fungal roots that connect to tree roots. And that's really important, because if you don't have a dense informal network, you've got a problem. Singapore government has got a really good one, because everybody does national service in the army. So they all know each other because they've done a year or 2 years in the army, they've gone back for exercises, their networks go across educational backgrounds. England has a really bad one because the elite all went to the same 3 schools and the same 2 universities, so it's a perverse network. And go into French industry and find anybody who didn't go to a Paris Grande École, and you'll see the lack of diversity in both of those countries' governance systems. Yeah? So that ability to network is key, and that should be a measure of health for any HR director, is how dense are your informal networks, and that's easy to do. And the third one, this is called acceptation. Now, this is a key concept in innovation. So if you don't know it, all dinosaurs had feathers, and they were very colorful. We know this from discoveries in North China. It's pretty evident they evolved principally for sexual display. Yeah, so you then get this small breed of dinosaur which starts to develop skin flaps under its forelimbs. So it adapts over time, And that allows it, like a peacock, to better display its feathers for sexual purposes. And it's a very small dinosaur, and it's more prey than it is predator, so it has to run very fast, and when it runs, it starts to glide. And that's how we get flight. Yeah? It couldn't happen in a linear way, because if dinosaurs jumped off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, they probably wouldn't get a chance to breed. So what happened is a trait which evolved for one function in a linear way, under stress, exapts for something completely different. The scary one, by the way, for you is the cerebellum at the base of your brain. Evolved in higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers. It then exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. The huge sophistication of grammar wasn't possible in a linear way. It's too big a step. So it requires this non-linear repurposing. Most of your higher functions evolved for something completely different. And if you look at it in technology, IBM was the worldwide market leader in punch card technology. It repurposed it to give it early dominance in the computer industry. In 1945, somebody realized the significance of a chocolate bar melting in their pocket. They put a metal box around it. We got microwave ovens. Now, the primary work, by the way, on this field is done at an annual conference up on Lake Garda, which I'm part of, with Milan University. But the whole conditions for exaptation is something you can manage, because in a crisis, you need to rapidly repurpose things you're already good at for something completely new. And that means mapping what you know at the right level of granularity, and very few organizations do that. And then kind of like, if anybody wants to get into this, and I'm going to talk about this briefly now, constraints are key. Constraints are the only thing you can manage in a complex adaptive system. So we need to map the constraints and understand them. And I'll just draw where we're going on that in a second. And I'm checking, I know how long I've got because I know when he finished, so I'm working to that. If you want to know more about this, by the way, you can download the field guide for free. You can get a free physical copy of it. If you've had the sense to remain Europeans, you don't have to pay the postage. If you're not Europeans, you have to pay the postage. But you can get that. And there's a whole flow chart and everything around this about how you adopt it. One of the big things we're doing for companies at the moment is go back and map everything which happened during COVID, what worked, what didn't work, building that interest into what's called a sacred storybook, because we need to remember what happened in COVID, and narrative is a form on that, and then identifying ways forward. So I'll leave that with the QR code up later for that as it goes. So that leads me into kind of like the last two sections of what I'm doing, which I'm going to go very quickly, because this is going to be more tomorrow. The big thing we're now doing, this is the sort of third framework within Cynefin, is estuarine mapping. Now, one of the reasons I came up with the idea of an estuary is certain friends of mine who should know better started to talk about constructional law, where everything flows in one direction. And the whole problem with that is that reality is human systems are not subject to the second law of thermodynamics. So taking a thermodynamics model is a bad starting place, all right? Open systems. Right? And also, human beings work through abstractions. We can go backwards as well as forwards. Right? So the point about an estuary is not a delta. A delta is where the water flows into the ocean. In an estuary, the water comes back in up the river channel. So the water goes in and the water goes out. Right? And you can do things at the turn of the tide that you can't do when the tide is flowing. There are granite cliffs you only have to survey every 20 years. There are sandbanks you have to check every day. So the metaphor of an estuary is a really good understanding of the sort of place we live in. And the way we're now working on that, and so I'll do this tomorrow, is we're basically building a grid which is energy cost of change against time to change. We're mapping the constraints onto that, and then we're identifying what's called the counterfactual line. And that says everything this side of the line isn't going to change. So our space of operation is here. Now, so I'm going to go through this tomorrow. I'm more excited by this than I was about Cynefin, because it doesn't say what do we want to be. It says what's the space in which we're playing, and how do we stabilize that system, because the fundamental principle is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. If the energy cost of sin is lower than the energy cost of virtue, people will sin. In complexity, you change the environment so that good things are more likely to happen, and then you reinforce it. You don't decide what those things should be in advance because you can't know, and that's a real switch in the way that we think. So, to finish, what do we do about Agile? If you haven't read the book, there's a famous British book which I'm referencing here. Agile has become a bunch of anally retentive control fetishists fighting framework wars who think everything is about who's got the better certificates. Yeah? I remember when SAFE came out, I first saw it at Novi Sad, which is significant, all right, if you know the history of Novi Sad. And I remember writing a tirade at the guy, I don't often write angry blogs, well, yes I do, but this was a very angry one, called the infantilization of management. Yeah, the way SAFE worked, and I remember looking at it and saying, this is wrong a priori. And then the Agile people didn't know what I meant by a priori, which depressed me about their education, right? So I went a posteriori and it got more confused. It's wrong because you don't scale by aggregation, you scale by decomposition and recombination. Right? So we've got to do something different about Agile because it's lost that edge. And one of the things I've been talking about of late is kind of like the need to rewild it. This is the nearest thing we got to the original canine in evolutionary history. It's a prairie wolf. Now, when you domesticate, and there's about 8 or 9 varieties of wild canine, and they're very resilient. If you domesticate them, you end up with a huge amount of non-functional things which wouldn't survive in the wild. That's the state of Agile. Yeah? Is nothing but a series, yeah. So where we're going on this, and the other problem is, what we call the mindset miasma. Sorry, I thought I'd use a plague mask. I think that is from Florence, actually, that famous illustration. Yeah, because we didn't understand the plague, so people thought if they wore those masks, it would be brilliant. Mindset is a completely nonsensical term like mental models. It's not the way we make decisions. Consciousness is distributed into the body and our social connections. There isn't a mindset. This is a computer model of the human brain, and it's not like that. And the trouble with mindset, as Nigel said, is if my big program, my wonderful Agile program doesn't work, it's not my fault, it's your fault because you didn't have an Agile mindset. Yeah? We now talk about this, I'll do more on this tomorrow, but we talk about what has agency, what has affordance, and what has assemblage. And we don't mean by assemblage what he means by assemblage, but that's an ongoing debate, all right? Some of us show respect for Deleuze and Guattari, but basically, agency is what or who can actually act. Affordance is what's enabled to you by the environment you're in, which includes your own history. And assemblage are the patterns of micro-narratives which determine the way you see the world. Yeah? And actually, that's a much more meaningful way of talking about it than mindset of mental models, because I've described a problem in the way that I can do something. And so, as Nigel said, the way we're going with Agile, and this is an open source initiative, is basically we're taking every Agile framework and method, working with the originators to break it down into its lowest coherent components, and then creating kits by which people can combine and recombine in different ways. So you can peel a sprint out of a scrum and replace it with a 3-month time box. Yeah? And you'll see on this, if you look at it, here we've got our methods, which are branded cognitive edge. I just talked about entangled trios. 888 I'll go through tomorrow. Here we've been working with Ivor Jacobson with his version of Scrum at Sail, breaking it down, but we're going to have 3 Scrum sets in it. And overall, there's a whole principle about how they work, a standard set. And all of this is open source. Anybody can copy it. And it's got a completely separate brand from our brand. Our methods and tools are branded Cynefin Company. It's an independent brand. It's open source. Anybody can produce. And we're not just doing this for Agile, by the way. We're doing this for foresight and strategy and organizational change. And the idea is to move away from the big consultancies, the big technical firms with a single approach and a single framework into multi-method, multi-vendor. So if anybody's interested in that, get in touch. And I'll just leave you with one final thought. Actually, process matters. You can have the most gifted leaders, the most motivated people, the best mindsets, But the reality is, if you haven't built a body of methods and tools and process which has been tested over the years, you will not survive as an organization. It's about systems more than it's about people. And in complexity, how people connect is far more important than what they are. And it's more ethical to manage that. Thank you very much for your time.